Veronica deserves everything. You're worthless and always have been, my mother, Frances, declared, her voice cutting through the law office like a blade. I sat in a leather chair, my hands folded in my lap, watching her pace behind my sister, with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the cards. The mahogany-paneled conference room felt smaller with each passing second, the weight of her words pressing down on my chest like stones. My name is Judith, and at 29 years old, I had spent most of my life being reminded that I was the disappointment, the burden, the daughter who never quite measured up. Veronica, 3 years younger and perpetually golden in our mother's eyes, sat primly beside Frances, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the table in anticipation. The lawyers were running 10 minutes late, but Frances couldn't contain her excitement any longer. Rose always knew Veronica was special. Frances continued, her eyes gleaming with vindictive satisfaction. Beautiful, charming, everything a grandmother could want in a granddaughter. You were just there, an obligation. I felt the familiar sting of her words, but a quiet, deeper strength I had cultivated over years of managing Grandma Rose's affairs kept me steady. The ornate grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, marking time until the moment that would change everything. Frances had no idea what was coming, and I found myself almost grateful for her cruelty. It would make what happened next feel like justice rather than revenge. I can't wait to redecorate Grandma's house, Veronica said dreamily, already planning her inheritance. Those antiques are so outdated. I'm thinking modern minimalist, maybe some of those expensive Italian fixtures I saw in the magazine. Frances beamed with pride. Whatever you want, darling. Rose's savings account should cover renovations easily. $20,000 goes quite far when you're smart about spending. I watched them discuss their plans, feeling like a ghost in my own family. They spoke about Grandma Rose's house, her jewelry collection, her modest savings account with such certainty and entitlement. Not once did they mention the 3 years I had spent visiting Rose every Tuesday and Thursday, helping her organize her papers, listening to her stories, and learning about the business investments she had carefully hidden from my mother's gambling addiction. The door handle turned, and I straightened in my chair. The lawyers had arrived, carrying briefcases, and wearing expressions that suggested this reading would be anything but routine. Frances smoothed her hair and adjusted her jacket, preparing to collect what she believed was rightfully Veronica's. What my mother didn't know was that Grandma Rose had been far more perceptive than anyone gave her credit for, and infinitely more wealthy than my family had ever imagined. The months leading up to this moment had been filled with a careful dance between my grandmother and me, one that my mother and sister had been too self-absorbed to notice. Every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 3 years, I had driven the 45 minutes from my apartment in downtown Minneapolis to Grandma Rose's modest house in the suburbs, ostensibly to help her with household tasks and provide companionship in her later years. What actually happened during those visits was far more complex. Rose would brew her signature chamomile tea, settle into her favorite armchair, and begin discussing her little projects, business investments she had been making for over 2 decades. Most people saw Rose as a sweet, elderly woman living on Social Security and a small pension from her late husband's factory job. The reality was that she owned controlling interests in 5 different companies, ranging from a successful catering business to a small but profitable real estate development firm. "Frances has a problem, Judith," Rose had confided in me during one of our early conversations. "I've watched her gamble away 3 different windfall payments over the years. Her father's life insurance, the settlement from her car accident, even the money I gave her for Veronica's college fund. All of it disappeared into those casino machines. I had suspected as much. Frances's frequent business trips to nearby casinos, her mood swings that coincided with mysterious financial stress, and her constant requests for loans from Rose had painted a clear picture. What I hadn't realized was how methodically Rose had been protecting her assets from my mother's addiction. "I need someone I can trust to help me manage these investments," Rose had said, sliding a folder across her kitchen table. "Someone who won't see dollar signs and forget about responsibility." The folder contained corporate documents, financial statements, and partnership agreements worth approximately $15 million. Rose had spent decades quietly building this business empire, reinvesting profits and expanding her holdings while maintaining the facade of a simple retiree. She had chosen me as her successor not out of favoritism, but out of necessity. Francis's gambling debts had put creditors on alert, and they were already sniffing around Rose's estate, hoping to collect when she passed. Your mother believes. I have $20,000 in savings and a house worth maybe $150,000, Rose had explained with a slight smile. Let her continue believing that. These businesses need protection from her creditors, and more importantly, they need someone who understands their value. I had spent those 3 years learning every aspect of Rose's investments, meeting with corporate attorneys, and ensuring that the business succession would be legally airtight. Francis and Veronica had occasionally made snide comments about my charity work with Rose, never bothering to ask what we actually discussed during our long afternoons together. Now, as the lawyers settled into their chairs and began arranging documents, I felt the weight of those secret conversations. Rose's plan was about to unfold exactly as she had designed it, and my mother's cruelty would finally come with a price she never could have imagined. Mr. Harrison, the primary estate attorney, was a distinguished man in his 60s who had worked with Rose for over 15 years. He cleared his throat and opened the official will document, his reading glasses perched carefully on his nose. Francis and Veronica leaned forward eagerly, while I remained composed, my heart beating steadily as the moment approached. The last will and testament of Rose Elizabeth Thompson, Mr. Harrison began formally. I, Rose Elizabeth Thompson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my worldly possessions as follows. Francis gripped Veronica's hand, both women, barely containing their excitement. They had been anticipating this moment for months, ever since Rose's health had begun declining. I watched them with a mixture of sadness and determination, knowing that their joy would be short-lived, but necessary. To my granddaughter Veronica. I leave my family home at 1247 Elm Street, including all furnishings, fixtures, and personal belongings contained within. Additionally, I bequeath to Veronica my complete jewelry collection and the contents of my savings account at First National Bank. Veronica squealed with delight, her hands flying to her mouth in theatrical surprise. Francis began crying tears, of what appeared to be gratitude, though I suspected they were tears of relief at securing what she believed would solve her mounting debts. They embraced dramatically while Mr. Harrison continued reading the formal language of the bequest. The jewelry alone must be worth $30,000, Francis whispered loudly to Veronica. And that house is in such a desirable neighborhood now. I felt a familiar pang of exclusion as they celebrated, but it was quickly replaced by anticipation. Rose had warned me that this moment would be difficult, that watching them receive what they believed was everything would test my resolve. She had been right. Seeing their triumphant faces, hearing their immediate plans to liquidate Rose's memory for cash made my chest tighten with grief and anger. To my granddaughter Judith, Mr. Harrison continued, I leave my collection of business documents and corporate files housed in the filing cabinet in my home office. Francis actually laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed through the conference room. Business documents? What business documents? Mother never had any business besides collecting Social Security. Veronica giggled along with her mother. Poor Judith gets the boring paperwork while I get the house and jewelry. I guess that's, fitting. They exchanged a look of shared amusement, their cruelty casual and automatic. I absorbed their mockery without reaction, knowing that their laughter would turn to something very different within the next few minutes. Rose's plan was working perfectly. They were so convinced of their victory that they wouldn't see the reversal coming until it was too late. Mr. Harrison closed the will and set it aside, but he made no move to conclude the meeting. Instead, he looked directly at me with an expression that suggested the real business was just beginning. As Francis and Veronica continued their whispered celebration, a second attorney entered the conference room. Margaret Kowalski, was a sharp-featured woman in her 40s who specialized in corporate law, and her presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. She carried a thick briefcase and wore the kind of confident expression that suggested she held information that would change everything. "Ladies," Mr. Harrison said, "I'd like you to meet Margaret Kowalski from Silverpine Holdings. She has some additional documents that pertain to Rose's estate." Frances barely looked up from her conversation with Veronica about redecorating plans. Additional documents? What kind of additional documents? The will was very clear. Margaret settled into her chair and opened her briefcase with deliberate precision. "Mr. Harrison is correct that the will addresses Rose's personal property, her home, jewelry, and savings account. However, those items represent only a small fraction of Rose's total assets." Veronica's head snapped up from her phone, where she had been texting friends about her inheritance. "What do you mean, small fraction? Grandma wasn't wealthy. She lived in that tiny house and drove that old car." "Rose Thompson was indeed very wealthy," Margaret replied calmly. "She simply chose to live modestly while building a substantial business empire. For the past 22 years, she owned controlling interests in 5 different companies, managed through a complex but legal corporate structure designed to protect her assets." The color began draining from Frances's face. "Business empire? That's impossible. My mother worked at the post office for 30 years and then retired. She never mentioned any businesses." I watched my mother's confidence start to crumble as Margaret spread corporate documents across the conference table. The papers bore Rose's signature, notarized dates going back decades, and financial statements that showed profits in the millions. Frances picked up one document with trembling fingers, scanning the numbers with growing horror. "These companies," Margaret continued, "include North Peak Engineering, a civil engineering firm that has contracted with the State Highway Department for 15 years. Rayner Publishing, which owns the rights to several successful regional magazines. Jasper Hollow Foods, a catering company that services major corporate events throughout the Twin Cities. Oxben Technologies, a small but profitable software development firm, and Larkspur and Finch, a real estate development partnership that has built 3 successful residential communities." Veronica's face had gone pale. "How much? How much are these companies worth?" "The combined value based on the most recent appraisals is approximately $15 million. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. Frances made a small choking sound, while Veronica gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Their celebration had transformed into stunned silence, replaced by the dawning realization that they had been operating under completely false assumptions about Rose's wealth. "Where did the money come from?" Frances whispered. "How could she afford to buy businesses?" Margaret consulted her notes. "Rose began investing in 2002, using your father's life insurance settlement as initial capital. Instead of spending that money, she partnered with existing business owners who needed investors. Over time, she acquired controlling interest through careful reinvestment of profits. She was, by all accounts, an extremely shrewd businesswoman." I watched my mother's face cycle through disbelief, confusion, and growing dread. Frances had always dismissed Rose as a simple woman who needed taking care of, never recognizing the sharp intelligence that had built an empire right under everyone's noses. The condescension Frances had shown toward Rose's little hobbies was now revealed as willful blindness to her mother's remarkable success. "But why didn't she tell us?" Veronica demanded. "Why keep it a secret?" Margaret's expression grew serious. Rose was very concerned about protecting these assets from potential creditors. She had observed certain gambling habits within the family and wanted to ensure that her business empire would remain intact. Frances's face flushed red with humiliation and rage. The carefully hidden truth about her addiction was now exposed, in front of lawyers and documented in corporate files that could never be denied or dismissed. Margaret reached into her briefcase and withdrew another set of documents, these ones bearing more recent dates and signatures. Rose updated her corporate succession plan 18 months ago, after careful consideration of who should inherit control of these businesses. Frances lunged forward in her chair. Veronica is her primary heir. The will clearly states. The will addresses Rose's personal property, Margaret interrupted firmly. Corporate ownership operates under different legal structures. These businesses were never part of her personal estate. They were held in trust with designated successors chosen based on Rose's assessment of their business acumen and financial responsibility. I felt my heart rate increase as the moment approached. For 3 years, I had known this day would come, but experiencing it felt surreal. Frances and Veronica were about to learn that their assumptions about family hierarchy meant nothing in the face of Rose's careful planning. Who inherits the businesses? Veronica asked, her voice strained with anxiety. Margaret turned to face me directly. Judith Thompson has been designated as the primary successor for all 5 companies. She has been working closely with Rose for the past 3 years, learning the operations and meeting with management teams. The transition is designed to be seamless. The silence that followed was deafening. Frances stared at me as if seeing a stranger, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Veronica's perfect composure shattered completely, her face contorting with disbelief and fury. That's impossible, Frances finally managed to say. Judith doesn't know anything about business. She's... Actually, I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the lawyers had arrived. I've been learning about these companies for 3 years. Every Tuesday and Thursday when I visited Grandma Rose, we went over financial reports, met with managers, and discussed long-term strategy. She was an incredible teacher. Veronica's eyes filled with tears of rage. You knew about the money this whole time and said nothing? Rose asked me to keep the businesses confidential until after her death, I replied calmly. She was concerned about protecting them from outside interference. Frances's face twisted with understanding. Outside interference? You mean my debts? Margaret nodded. Rose was very explicit about her concerns. She had observed multiple instances where family resources were lost to gambling debts, and she wanted to ensure that her business empire remained stable and productive. The weight of the revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Frances realized that not only had she underestimated her own mother's wealth and intelligence, but that her gambling addiction had cost her family access to millions of dollars. Her years of condescension toward Rose, her dismissal of Rose's boring conversations about investments, had blinded her to the empire that was being built right in front of her. $15 million, Veronica whispered, as if saying the number might make it less real. $15 million, and you get all of it. I inherited the responsibility of managing these companies, I corrected. Rose built something remarkable, and she trusted me to continue her work. Frances stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This isn't fair. Veronica is the primary heir. There has to be some way to contest this. Margaret's expression remained professional but firm. The corporate succession has been legally established for years. Every document has been properly notarized, witnessed, and filed with appropriate authorities. Rose worked with multiple attorneys to ensure there would be no grounds for contest. The trap Rose had laid was perfect in its simplicity. She had given Frances and Veronica exactly what they expected, while protecting what truly mattered from their potential interference. Frances began pacing behind her chair like a caged animal. Her earlier triumph now transformed into desperate calculation. There has to be something we can do, some legal challenge, some way to prove that Mother wasn't in her right mind when she made these arrangements. Margaret opened another folder with practiced efficiency. Rose anticipated such concerns. She underwent a comprehensive psychological evaluation 6 months ago, specifically to demonstrate her mental competency. The results show her cognitive function was well above average for her age group. I watched my mother's face as each avenue of denial was systematically closed off. Rose had thought of everything, spending years building legal barriers that would protect her businesses from the very scenario that was unfolding now. Frances's gambling addiction, Her pattern of viewing family resources as her own personal bank account had finally met an obstacle she couldn't manipulate or overcome. "But the house," Veronica said desperately. "At least I still have the house and jewelry. That's something." Margaret consulted her notes with an expression that suggested more bad news. "Unfortunately, there are some complications regarding those assets as well. Rose's creditors have been monitoring the estate, and there are significant liens against both the property and the jewelry collection." Francis's face went white. "Liens? What liens?" "Your gambling debts, Francis. Several casinos have obtained judgments against you over the past 2 years. They've been waiting for Rose's estate to settle so they could collect against any inherited assets. The house and jewelry will need to be liquidated to satisfy those obligations." The final piece of Rose's protection strategy became clear. She had known that any assets left to Veronica would ultimately end up in Francis's hands, and from there would be seized by creditors. By giving Veronica the house and jewelry, Rose had effectively given her nothing. Worse than nothing, since Veronica would now be responsible for the legal proceedings required to transfer the assets to the casinos. Veronica collapsed back into her chair, tears streaming down her face. "So, I get nothing? Nothing at all? You'll receive whatever remains after the creditors are satisfied," Mr. Harrison said gently. "Unfortunately, given the value of the liens versus the appraised value of the property and jewelry, there's unlikely to be any significant remainder." Francis turned to face me with an expression of pure hatred. "You planned this. You manipulated her into cutting us out." "I helped Grandma Rose manage her businesses," I replied steadily. "Everything else was her decision, based on her observations of this family over many years." "This isn't over," Francis snarled. "I'll find a way to fight this. I'll prove that you influenced her, that you took advantage of an elderly woman." Margaret's voice cut through Francis's threats with professional authority. "I should mention that Rose documented her reasoning extensively. She kept detailed records of family interactions, including recordings of conversations where gambling debts were discussed. She also documented instances where family members made disparaging comments about her intelligence or business acumen." Recordings. I remembered Rose's small digital recorder, which she had started using after Francis made particularly cruel comments about Rose's supposed simplicity. My grandmother had been building a legal defense against exactly the kind of challenge Francis was threatening to mount. Francis sank into her chair, the fight draining out of her as she realized the scope of Rose's preparation. Every contingency had been considered, every possible objection anticipated and countered. Rose had spent 3 years not just teaching me about her businesses, but building an unassailable legal fortress around the succession plan. The woman my family had dismissed as a simple retiree had outmaneuvered them completely, ensuring that her life's work would be protected from the very people who had taken her generosity for granted. I reached into my purse and withdrew a sealed envelope that Rose had given me 6 months before her death. "Grandma Rose asked me to give this to both of you after the legal proceedings were complete." Francis and Veronica stared at the envelope as if it might explode. Their faces bore the hollow expressions of people who had just watched their entire worldview collapse. With trembling fingers, Francis opened the envelope and unfolded the handwritten letter inside. "My dear Francis and Veronica," Francis read aloud, her voice breaking. "If you are reading this, then my business empire has been revealed, and you understand the true scope of what you have lost. I want you to know that this was not a decision I made lightly." Veronica leaned over to read along, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Francis continued reading, her voice growing smaller with each word. "Francis, your gambling addiction has cost this family more than you realize. The money you asked me for over the years, the loans you never repaid, came from profits these businesses generated. I calculated that your debts have cost the family over $200,000 in the past 5 years alone." Francis's hands shook as she held the letter. She kept track. Francis read on. Veronica, you have never shown interest in anything beyond spending money and acquiring material possessions. When I tried to discuss my investments with you, you dismissed them as boring old lady hobbies. You made it clear that you saw me as nothing more than a source of inheritance. Veronica sobbed openly now, the weight of her grandmother's disappointment finally reaching her. Judith, on the other hand, spent 3 years learning about these businesses, not because she wanted to inherit them, but because she genuinely cared about my well-being and respected my intelligence. She never asked me for money, never dismissed my accomplishments, and never treated me like a burden. Frances finished reading the letter, her voice barely a whisper. I leave these businesses to Judith because she has earned them through dedication, respect, and genuine love. What you inherit, or failed to inherit, is the result of choices you made over many years. I hope you learn from this experience, though I fear you may not. Love, Mother. The conference room fell silent except for Veronica's quiet crying. Frances stared at the letter for a long moment before carefully folding it and placing it back, in the envelope. When she looked up at me, her expression had changed from anger to something closer to defeat. She really planned all of this, Frances said quietly. Every detail. Yes, I replied. She spent 3 years making sure everything would be legally protected and properly documented. Margaret began packing her documents. Judith, you'll need to meet with the management teams of each company within the next 2 weeks. The transition plans are already in place, but there are some signatures required to finalize the transfers. I nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. Rose had prepared me well for this moment, but actually becoming the owner of 5 successful companies felt surreal. I'll make time in my schedule. Frances stood up slowly, moving like someone much older than her 54 years. I suppose congratulations are in order. You played this very well. I didn't play anything, I said firmly. I loved Grandma Rose, and she recognized that love. Everything else followed from there. Veronica finally looked up from her hands. What happens now? What are we supposed to do? You'll need to work with your mother's creditors to liquidate the inherited assets, Mr. Harrison explained. The process will take several months, but it should satisfy the outstanding debts. And after that? Veronica asked. After that, you'll need to build your own lives, I said, not unkindly. Grandma Rose gave you the same gift she gave me, the opportunity to learn from your mistakes. What you do with that opportunity is up to you. Frances gathered her purse and stood to leave. I suppose we won't be seeing much of each other anymore. That depends, I replied. The door is always open if you're ready to build a different kind of relationship. But the days of taking family for granted are over. Frances and Veronica discovered that the gambling debts had grown far beyond what they initially realized, with compound interest and legal fees bringing the total owed to nearly $400,000. The house and jewelry, after appraisals and legal costs, barely covered 2/3 of the debt, leaving Frances personally liable for the remainder and forcing her into bankruptcy. Veronica, now responsible for her mother's financial choices, lost her credit rating and social standing when the bankruptcy became public record, while their extended family and social circle learned the full scope of the gambling addiction that had cost them millions. Both women were forced to find employment for the first time in years, working entry-level positions while I managed a business empire worth $15 million, a daily reminder of how their cruelty and entitlement had cost them everything. Looking back on that day in the conference room, I realized that Grandma Rose had given me more than just financial security. She had taught me that true power comes from earning respect rather than demanding it, and that the most satisfying revenge is simply allowing people to face the natural consequences of their own choices.